YouTubers, Fortune Cookie 45 LC coming to you from the hot lead zone, and I'd like you to compare this brass, which is 44 Magnum brass, that Mark has processed. Now, he doesn't shoot 44 Magnum, so what he did was he gave me this brass. As you know, we showed it to you before. But what Mark did with this brass was he deprimed it, and then he tumbled it in dry media vibratory tumbler for 8 hours. And then he washed off the dust and dried it and got this brass, which is extremely clean and polished. You won't see Reloader's brass much better than this. We'll give you a close-up in a little while, but let's compare this brass with the brass that is from EastCoastArsenal. Now, as you know, EastCoastArsenal brass is extremely clean and polished, but it's also processed to the point that it's already resized, trimmed, and ready to load. So if I were going to use this brass to load cast bullets, I would flare the case mouth and then go ahead and prime and put a powder charge in, seat the bullet, and we'd be done. But let's compare this brass, the very best Reloader's brass, with perhaps the very best commercial polished brass. So here is brass from EastCoastArsenal. It's 357 Magnum brass, and look how nicely polished that is. We'll compare that with the brass from Mark. Let's look at that one more time. Compare. And it looks to me like EastCoastArsenal brass is actually a little bit better polished than Mark's brass, which has been processed and polished for 8 hours, tumbled. So here you see Mark's cases on the left and EastCoastArsenal cases on the right. Notice that Mark's primer pockets are a little cleaner than the primer pockets from EastCoastArsenal. Now the inside of the cases is about the same, and the outside goes to EastCoastArsenal. Now perhaps the primer pockets, being small primer pockets, don't clean as nicely as the large primer pocket, but you'd have to say that buying your brass from EastCoastArsenal gives you pretty good brass because it's ready to load. It's already resized and it's already trimmed and deprimed. Mark's brass hasn't been resized, hasn't been trimmed, but it has been deprimed. So if you want good brass and you're willing to go ahead and pay for it, then EastCoastArsenal might be very good for you. If you're willing to vibe the brass for 8 hours and then wash it and then dry it, then you can do your own and get brass that's just about as good as commercially cleaned and polished and processed. I think my plan would be that if I were competing and I was going to reload for competition, I'd buy the brass from EastCoastArsenal, and then all my practice ammo I would go ahead and continue to do my own cleaning and polishing and processing. However, it would be fun to look into the wet polishing to see if the wet polishing will do as well as the results from EastCoastArsenal. So YouTubers out there, take care. We're going to go into an investigation on wet polishing tumbling.